What was the reason that prompted a man like Columbus, whose own maritime skills were controversial, to embark on this seemingly impossible expedition? What were the golden dreams, the attractive promises that led this fleet to depart from a Spanish port? How did he convince Queen Isabella of Spain and, an even more difficult task, persuade his skeptical and frightened crew to accompany him on this unknown journey? At what point during the voyage did the crew become determined to take their own captain's life? And despite all these difficulties, mutinies, and disappointments, how did these ships finally reach those unknown shores that were later named the New World? But before that, please subscribe to the channel. Christopher Columbus, although an experienced sailor, was by no means the expert in maritime affairs that he portrayed himself to be. He was an average captain who knew how to use a few basic instruments like the compass, but he was no great navigator. His biggest mistake was his own estimate of the Earth's size, which he made by misinterpreting the work of the ancient Greek scholar Ptolemy. He believed the Earth was much smaller than it actually is, and that reaching Asia by sailing west from Europe would be easy. He had no idea that a vast continent and two great oceans lay between them.
This fear of the unknown, doubts about the captain's skill, and the length of the journey, which was becoming far longer than his estimates, were the primary factors that increased the crew's anxiety and brought them to the brink of mutiny. Behind all this, the planning of the Spanish government, especially Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, was also very profound. In the late 15th century, Europe, particularly Spain, was entering a new era. After expelling the Muslims from Al-Andalus, their sights were now set on global trade and treasures of gold and silver.
The traditional land route to the east was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which was expensive and dangerous for Christian Europe. Portugal had taken the lead by finding a sea route around Africa. In such a situation, Spain desperately needed an alternative and faster route, and Columbus's plan for a western route seemed like an excellent opportunity. Queen Isabella made several attractive promises to Columbus that were no less than a dream for any adventurer. The biggest promise was that of social status. Columbus was assured that in case of success, he would be included among the Spanish nobility.
He was to be given the title of caballero, but his real significance was that the holders of this title and their future generations could use the title Don before their names. In the Spanish society of that era, the title Don was considered a symbol of social superiority, immense respect, and power. It was not just a title, but a great honor passed down through generations. The second major promise was the position of Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He was to receive rights equal to the Grand Admiral of the Castilian state of Spain, meaning he would become an extremely powerful figure in maritime affairs and the governor of all newly discovered lands.
The financial aspect was also extremely important in such a grand expedition. It was decided that Columbus would receive 1/10 or 10% of the total value of all wealth obtained from the new lands he discovered, whether it be gold, silver, or precious stones. Additionally, 1/8 of the cargo of all commercial ships coming to Spain from these discovered territories would be permanently reserved for Columbus's goods, meaning he would also become a permanent shareholder in this trade. These were truly life-changing promises.
To persuade the crew to embark on this dangerous and unknown journey, a significant incentive was also offered. It was announced that whichever crew member first sighted land would be given an annual pension of 10,000 maravedis for life. This was a considerable sum for that era, equivalent to about $1,500 annually today. This reward was certainly a major attraction for many sailors.
But despite these grand promises, when the time came for practical preparations, the Queen's help was limited. Queen Isabella did not spend a very large sum directly from the national treasury, but instead issued a unique order. She sentenced the inhabitants of a coastal area called Palos, who were accused of violating royal decrees, to provide 2 caravel-type ships for Columbus's expedition for 1 year at their own expense, complete with crew and supplies in lieu of their punishment. Thus, the 2 famous ships, the Niña and the Pinta, were obtained as a penalty. For these 2 ships, a total crew of only 89 men, a few small cannons, some guns, and provisions were provided, which was highly inadequate for an intercontinental voyage. Columbus realized the gravity of the situation. Therefore, he made efforts himself and, after negotiating with the Pinzolan brothers, acquired a 3rd, relatively larger ship, E. Santa Maria, on loan. This ship then became the fleet's flagship, or main vessel on which Columbus himself sailed. Now there were 3 ships, and Red Cross markings were made on their large white sails for identification. Finally, on August 3, 1492, this historic journey began from the port of Palos. The fleet first headed southwest towards the Canary Islands located near the coast of Africa. The reason for this was purely a matter of maritime strategy. The Canary Islands were under Spanish control at the time, and from there the trade winds blew in a favorable direction for sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean, constantly pushing the sailing ships forward. After leaving the Canary Islands, the first few weeks were surprisingly calm. The sea was kind, the winds constantly filled the sails, and the ships were moving westward at a good speed.
It was Columbus's routine to come out of his cabin after breakfast, stand on the deck to survey the sky, pray for good weather, then talk to the crew, and afterwards return to his room where he would make entries in his maps and logbook.
If he wasn't such an expert, how did he determine direction? He relied on the traditional methods of that era. He had an instrument called a quadrant with which he could determine latitude, but accurately determining longitude was the biggest challenge of the time, and Columbus was not at all skilled in it. Therefore, he mostly relied on dead reckoning, which is estimating one's position based on the ship's speed, direction, and time. This method becomes extremely unreliable on long voyages.
The crew estimated that land should be sighted in perhaps 2 or 3 weeks. But when about 20 days passed and there was no sign of land on the horizon, whispers began on the ships. The word started to spread among the crew that this Italian, Columbus, would get them all killed. They demanded to turn back, but Columbus did not budge. When the hope of returning faded, some desperate crew members plotted to murder Columbus. The plan was to kill him at night, throw his body into the sea, and upon their return fabricate a story that he had accidentally fallen overboard. Columbus realized that the situation was deteriorating. The crew had begun to openly defy his orders. He tempted them with more rewards, reiterating promises of gold and wealth, but by now fear had overcome greed. In this despair, the crew often saw mirages of land. Patches of clouds on a distant horizon looked like land to them. They would shout with joy, but each time they got closer, an endless expanse would swallow their hopes.
In a state of deep despair, a ray of hope appeared on the evening of October 7th. At sunset, the crew saw huge flocks of birds flying in an organized manner towards the southwest. These were land birds, possibly migrating from North America to the Caribbean islands to spend the winter. Seeing such a large number of land birds flying in a specific direction was firm proof that land must be nearby. Columbus immediately ordered the fleet's course to be turned in the direction of the birds.
But unfortunately, even for the next 2 days, no land was sighted. The noise of the birds was increasing, but there was no sign of land. Now the despair became even more intense. The crew, who'd become a little hopeful, were now extremely angry. This time, the crews of the Nina and the Pinta slowed their ships to come close to Columbus's ship, the Santa Maria, and openly declare mutiny. They made it clear that they would not go a single inch further, and if they were forced, they would resort to violence.
Columbus had somehow managed to get through about 5 weeks, but now he was completely helpless. This was the decisive moment of his life and his expedition. As a last resort, he made an emotional appeal to the crew and asked for a grace period of just 3 days. He promised that if land was not sighted in the next 3 days, he himself would turn the ship's course back toward Spain. During these last 3 days, he continued sailing day and night with extreme recklessness, even ignoring the danger that the ships could collide with an unknown rock.
Finally, the moment that had been awaited for centuries arrived. On the night of October 12th at around 10 o'clock, Columbus, who was on the deck, saw a faint light on the distant horizon, like a candle flickering on and off. He immediately called his close companions, but only 1 or 2 people saw something faint. Based on today's knowledge and maps, at the time Columbus claimed to have seen the light, the nearest island was at least 56 kilometers away. From such a distance, and due to the curvature of the Earth, seeing a candlelight is scientifically impossible.
In reality, land was sighted about 4 hours after this incident, at 2 o'clock in the morning. Lookout sailor on the Pinta's mast, Rodrigo de Triana, caught sight of white sand dunes gleaming in the moonlight. When he was completely sure that it was indeed land, he shouted with all his might, "Tierra, tierra," meaning land, land. Upon hearing this, the captain of the Pinta, Martin Alonso Pinzon, immediately confirmed it and ordered a small cannon on the ship to be fired, which was the signal to give the good news to the other 2 ships.
An indescribable wave of joy spread throughout the fleet. After a long, arduous, and perilous journey of 36 days, Columbus's fleet had finally reached the shores of the land that would later be called the New World, a world whose existence was not even in Europe's wildest imagination. At that moment, Pinzon asked Columbus, "Sir Admiral, my reward won't be lost, will it?" Columbus showed generosity and said, "I will give you 5,000 maravedis as a gift."
But the most controversial aspect of the story is about that original reward. The annual pension of 10,000 maravedis, which was to be given to the first person to see land, was not given to Rodrigo de Triana. Upon returning to Spain, Columbus claimed that since he had seen that mysterious light 4 hours earlier, he had technically been the first to see land. On the basis of this claim, he had that lifetime pension registered in his own name. This act does not seem morally right and has been severely criticized in history.
And the greatest irony of this journey was yet to come. Columbus remained under the misconception until his death that he had reached Asia, or the Indies. He never realized that he had in fact discovered a completely new continent, a land that had been inhabited for thousands of years with its own civilizations. but which have been cut off from the rest of the world for the past 11,000 years, since the end of the last ice age.
Thus, an incredibly difficult journey full of uncertainty finally ended with the discovery of a new land. This was the moment that changed the course of human history forever. But this is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new and often dark chapter. This is where the thought-provoking point arises. Why are Christopher Columbus and his companions, who should have been undisputed heroes in history for this achievement, so controversial today? How were the native people treated? We will tell you all about this in the next episode of the History of America.